All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to host this conversation and hear more about Nickel Voice. Thank you, Jomo, for joining today. Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, the film is gorgeous. It's beautifully shot. The story is incredible, and I'm just honored to really be having this conversation. Before, when I was thinking about doing this, I thought, should I just interview Jomo? Should it be just he and I having a conversation? But then I thought that it was really interesting that my friend Johnny Simmons not only is a friend of Jomo and someone who's had history and has a relationship with Jomo, but Johnny actually lived and photographed the era that the film takes place in. And I was looking at some of Johnny's photographs that I'm putting on the screen here, and it's crazy to see that. Yeah, he actually lived this era. So I'm really excited again just to host this conversation, to be able to hear from someone who lived it, and then from someone who got to tell the story from a fresh perspective and an interesting perspective, which we'll dive into with all the POV work. And yeah, we're going to dive into the cinematography of Nickel Boys.
Hey everybody, Jomo, this is really exciting. It was so funny when Raul said, grew up during that era. And I was thinking about shooting movies in the South and how many times certain crew members that didn't know I was the DP asked me not to play around with the camera. I'm sure you've experienced a little of that if you were down there.
Absolutely. I mean, both down there and the Northeast, all over.
Yeah, me too, CBS Studios as well. But check it out. Jomo, more than anything, congratulations on Nickel Boys. And congratulations for yesterday's announcement from the National Society of Film Critics that you are being recognized for Best Cinematography, and Ramel is being recognized as Best Director, along with the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Cinematography, the Gotham Independent Film Award for Breakthrough Performance. Man, I tell you, I haven't checked the traps this morning. I'll do so later on today. I'll see who's making noise about Nickel Boys. I'm sure somebody out there is talking about it. It's just so good. Hey, Jomo, our journeys as cinematographers are always different, especially very different from the majority of us that work in the industry. I'd just like for a moment for you to tell us about your journey to this point, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who would really like to know what makes a Jomo happen.
I don't know what a Jomo is, and I don't even know how to make a Jomo happen. But I can say, with filmmaking, for me, it was, I remember the moment. I actually have the picture of the moment with me kind of looking behind a camera at age 7 when I told my parents I wanted to be a filmmaker. Um, and I remember the sensation. I remember the feeling because I was like, I was in a period where I was bouncing between a bunch of things. I remember telling my parents, "Oh, I want to be a scientist. I want to be an astronaut. Now I want to be, a biologist. Now I want to be a firefighter." And I remember that moment clicking for me when it was like, "Oh, maybe if I am a filmmaker." I can live the life of a biologist for 6 months. I can live the life of an astronaut for 6 months. I can live the life of a doctor for 3 months. And like, I think that I remember feeling like, oh my God, this is this incredible hack. In this way, I can live 1,000 lives in one life. Um, and, I think looking back on that now, I wonder what it was that really made me form that connection. I think maybe if I'm being generous with myself, it would be saying that I think even at that time, I was really fascinated with a certain level of like radical empathy, of truly feeling what it feels like to be outside of my body and be other people. I think that being a human is oftentimes so confusing that I think that for me, filmmaking is just an expression of my desire to not know or understand everything, but to explore just
Mm.
how multifaceted being human can be and how different people with different upbringings and different lives can inform the person that they are and the ways that that's similar to me and the ways that that's different to me. So yes, I said that, and God bless both of my immigrant parents were like, okay. Both of my parents were also scientists, so I think particularly they were like the arts. I don't really know what that is, but sure, we'll like put you in every single theater and film program we can possibly get you to in the area. And so it was through that that I kind of, growing up, I worked at a public access television station in my hometown in Worcester, Massachusetts. And, at that time it was like editing on VHS and different things. So I would be at the public access television station for kind of like most of my childhood and into my high school years working there and starting as an intern and then moving to an editor and then moving to someone shooting on the stage and then moving to a producer and a graphics designer. So I really think there was a way in which that time period really informed, especially with editing. Yeah, even into college, I was just always editing, and my friends and I were always making movies on the weekend. And if I couldn't get people together, I would like, take my Legos and try to make a movie with those and kind of do stop motion, cinematography. But yeah, I think it's only when I got older that I sort of started to realize that it was like, oh, because I just said a filmmaker. And I think as I got older, I realized like, oh, I was the person who always had the camera and always was like doing the shooting. I don't think I thought about it like that. But as an adult, it was watching movies like In the Mood for Love that, I remember kind of walking out of the theater just completely changed. Like and this is embarrassing to admit, but 20 minutes into the movie, I stopped reading the subtitles. I was just so hypnotized by the images that Mark Lee Ping-Bing and Christopher Doyle made it. And there was a way in which it wasn't hypnotized because I thought it was aesthetically beautiful per se, even though I think it is. It was that I was hypnotized by just the intensity of the emotion. I felt it just coming into my body like someone had turned on a water pump and just was hitting me like the feelings of longing, the feelings of like an unrequited love, the depth of connection. Like, I remember walking out of the movie and calling my mother and saying, like, I think I just saw one of my favorite movies ever. And she was like, what was it about? And I was like, I can't even tell you. I stopped reading, but I know what it's about. Emotionally, I know the feelings that was there, and it felt so real. I felt so connected to it. And I'd come into the theater emotionally totally neutral, and I left the theater kind of welled up, and that felt like a magic trick to me. And I think so much of that felt like the cinematography in that movie. Just it it incepted an emotion into me, and I think from that point forward, I became obsessively interested in filmmaking and in cinematography specifically, of creating images that could elicit emotions, could elicit feelings in my body, and I think ultimately just get to a place that I think, language gets in the way of sometimes people connecting person to person. And I think images aren't perfect, but there's a way in which images sometimes can have a more pure connection between people. You could see one another for the first time in a way that sometimes we get really, locked up on with language. So yeah, that's sorry, that's a long answer to say,
No, that's a
yeah,
very
I'm fascinated by images.
that's a very good answer. As a matter of fact, I got moved by that answer. And not only that, it was so much like when I first met you and we had creative conversations about your upcoming film. And I just fell in love with you because the things we talked about were not technical, except for a couple of things, like the Stedman Weaver head.
Yes, you got me into seven and the low angle prism. You got me having those always on my checkouts.
And I tell you, when I left you, I felt like I had left an artist. And, I was touched by our first meeting, as well as the approach to Nickel Boys is the same. When I saw it, it just made me rewind our experience together because you told me about the approach to Nickel Boys. Was that more than a year ago?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It might have been 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, I think no, I think you're right. I think we got lunch right after I wrapped.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But we can get off the personal note because we could talk about that for hours. But check it out, Jomo. Because our time is truly limited, I would really like for you to tell us a little bit more about how you guys conceived of the idea and this approach. Because, I mean, when you think about taking a POV approach, it, as my good friend Amy Vincent says to me, she says, "My God, that was so courageous to do that,"
Mm,
and and it was. I mean, look at. It. I mean, what are the examples that you have? Like when I was thinking about, I mean, there's like Vertigo, Terminator, Halloween, and obviously those movies are quite a distance away from anything like Nickel Boys. How, what what influenced you? What references did you have in regards to that POV approach? Tell me how that came about.
absolutely. So it was the real idea to go full POV throughout the process was Ramel. So he had
Ah,
gotten approached by Dee Gardner and Jeremy Kleiner at Plan B, who at that point had a manuscript of Colson's book before it was released, and they had loved Ramel's first movie, Hale County, This Morning, This Evening, which also had a profound effect on me the first time I saw it. And so they had kind of like gotten Colson's blessing before even talking to Ramel and sending him the manuscript because Colson really loved Hale County as well. And so Ramel, when he first read it, he kind of just envisioned it in a POV. And it's not in the book. The book, I believe, is written in the third person, but Ramel had been working on a Ramel's a visual artist and a photographer, kind of outside of film as well. And he had done a photograph 15 years ago called "I Home," and that photograph for him was kind of a conversation about what is authorship to an image. How do you create an image that undeniably ties the creator of the image to the image itself? And so that image, I Home, is an image of him taking an image of an image. And I think for him, he was like, well, that still didn't do it, because in theory he could have been a model who was off camera and the photographer was a different person. So I think for him, especially in thinking about images, like 99% of images of black bodies have been shot by people who aren't black, which is only to say that it's a community that has been photographed from outside of itself most often. So I think for Ramel, there was always a question of like, well, how do we create images to just add into the visual lexicon that gives an alternative way of thinking about seeing and photographing a community and a group of people. So I think that that's kind of what it started with for him. So it's like from our first meeting, Ramel was like, yeah, so I'm thinking about it POV. What do you think about that? And I think the first thing that I'd said was, I think that's probably going to necessitate a lot of conversations on what that means, even
yeah.
almost conceptually. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a point of view image? Because that begs a lot of questions. Like, in a point of view language, what's an establishing shot? What's an insert? What's a transition? What's a cut? How does time work? Are we jumping between moments? Is this memory? Like, and I think that kind of both of us from that initial moment, because I really got when I had seen Hale County, I saw it in 2018 when it premiered at Sundance. And I remember when the movie finished, I was almost in a fugue state. And then I realized the lights had come up and everyone in the theater was gone. And it was just me still sitting there. And it was in Hale County, those I saw things that I've never seen before in an image. There was a specificity in how he created images in that kind of blew me away. So then I was like, oh my God, I need to meet this director. I need to meet them because I need to understand. I need to ask them, how did they create these images? So then when I looked it up and found that the director was also the cinematographer of the movie, that just doubly intensified my desire to like meet this person and talk to them and talk about like how they're thinking about the image. So literally my incredible agent Anne Murphy sent me a breakdown for Ramel's first narrative movie, Nickel Boys, at 11:30 p.m. And at 11:35, I called her and was like, "Let's do it. Like, I want to take the meeting. I really want." And she was like, "You haven't read anything. You have not looked at any of these materials. Like, I just sent it to you. Like, what do you mean you want to take the meeting?" And I was just like, "We have to take the meeting." I Hale County was monumental. Honestly, I want to get in the room so that I can talk to the person who made Hale County. So I can, like, even beyond trying to get a job, I want to be in the room to try to understand and ask them, like, how did you come up with this? So, like, there was a purity, genuinely, to that desire of just connecting with Mel. Like, a lot of his images had been references for me on other features that I had done because I really loved his still photo work. So yeah, like it felt like that first interview kind of started a conversation that honestly still feels unending between Rebel and I. I feel like we're always talking constantly. I feel like even in prep, I feel like people had to pull us apart because we could just stand there just getting into some idea, just like spitting off for hours together. But and that's what it kind of was for this project too, where it was like in prep, he and I quite literally, like without exaggeration, spent maybe 70 or 80 hours, just the two of us in a room talking about conceptually, like, what does point of view mean? And when we're saying this term, what do we mean? And why is it important in this story? And what can we dig in and get deeper with it? And so it was like pretty quickly into those conversations, we kind of stopped using the term point of view and we started using the term. We were looking for a sentient image. We were looking for an image that had a consciousness to it, an image that felt tied to a body, almost like the camera was an organ inside of the body of the image, and an image that was taking place inside of the scene. It wasn't something that was looking at things happening. It was something that could be affected by the scene. And when we're thinking about two young black boys in the Jim Crow South, we were also talking about people who are navigating an often hostile space. We're also talking about a time period where quite literally a gaze can be the difference between a young boy living or dying that day. So there's a way in which it's hyper conscious to the people who are navigating those spaces. So that was kind of the impetus for us, is that we wanted to try to have an image that was hyper subjective, and an image that invited the audience into the body of another person, the consciousness of another person, moving through that. So, it was never really about the conceit of it, or like, oh, it'd be cool to do a movie point of view. It always was from this conversation of, well, we want to create an image that is hyper immersive. And I think there's a way, especially with movies with maybe, historical time periods, that just naturally, I think that there's a dissociation between you as an audience member, as the image in a theater. When you look at it, you're sitting in the audience, you're like, oh my God, that happened. That is wild. I'm glad it's not happening now. And I think that's fine. A lot of amazing movies have been made like that. I think for Ramel and I, it's almost like there's this really thin membrane between you as an audience member and as the image, a natural membrane. And I don't think it was our intention to tear it down. I think our intention was to just puncture it, like to make a small incision, a small hole in that membrane between you as audience and image as something separate. And hopefully, in creating that small puncture, just maybe a more intense and direct channel between you and the character, like almost like a gateway to just hopefully just more feeling and having a different kind of empathic relationship where with it, where it's not that you're seeing this happen to Elwood. And I think that was a lot of it, where it's like traditional cinema, we have close-ups, which are incredible. We can look at someone's face and we can delineate what are they feeling. I think with Nickel Boys, it's disorienting, honestly, as a viewer, to not have that information, not have a close-up, to not see physically what your character, your protagonist is feeling. But, I feel like in camera tests, as we were developing them, something strange happened to me where I feel like, because I didn't have that information, because I didn't have a close up that I could turn to and say, okay, Elwood is feeling this because look at he's not making eye contact, X, Y, and Z. On this movie, I feel like you feel unmoored because you don't have that information. But then I feel like almost another question comes up into your head where it's like, well, since I can't see what Elwood's feeling, like, what can I glean on what Elwood's feeling based on where he's looking in the room right now, who he's looking at and who he's not looking at? And then maybe I think almost secondarily, then the question becomes, well, since I also can't tell everything about how he's feeling based on where he's looking, what would I feel if this was happening to me? And if I was in this situation? Huh. And I feel like that's not a reinvention in any way, shape, or form. I think it's just moving 2 degrees to the left or to the right of the question that is always asked in cinema. But I think for me personally, there was something that kind of happened there, in that being like just 2 degrees off, that there was an intimacy that was created with the protagonist. But honestly, again, with a lot of these things, it's like, because there was such heavy artifice to it, we didn't want the actors to have to kind of be more artifice than looking into the camera already. So almost all of the lighting with the amazing Bob Bates and Gary Kelso, our key grip, and our gaffer, we would do kind of use a lot of mirrors and use really big and broad sources pushing in, or we would build lights into the set and really try to avoid having lights on set when we could. And we also did every single scene as a oneer, where we knew we were going to cut it up and we knew we were going to section it up, but we wanted the actors to always, from action to cut, to be into one emotional arc, to feel the
Ooh,
entire scene.
okay,
And
okay.
so because of that, it meant that, all the camera systems and all the devices, it then turns a script into like 112 trick shots where every single scene has to be a oneer, and we would basically shoot each oneer with a 20-second variation, a 30-second variation, and a 45-second variation, so that the editor and Ramel could still kind of pace and kind of accordion those things in the edit. But yeah, it also meant that we just had to have systems that could survive an entire move, which just necessitated a lot of camera tests, and a lot of testing with different apparatuses that we wouldn't think we would normally use. But it would be a problem of, well, how do we sit on a bus and look underneath the chair of a bus at a girl,
Wow,
crawling
yeah.
underneath the seats? Like, okay, let's get out a piece of graph paper and try to figure out as a team, how we can get that done. Was a lot of the challenge, but also so much of the fun of this project.
I'll tell you, what you just answered defined the difference between the subjective approach. It transcends subjective cinematography. And not only that, but you basically had to become the actor. And that camera definitely had to have the curiosity, the apprehension, the paranoia, the stress of where Elwood was, and that's the amazing thing about it, is because it's not subjective anymore. And I guess that's the difference between the examples of point of view movies that we've seen in the past. It's different when what's going to happen is going to happen to you. And you had to be the actor, and that camera had to become that. You had to embrace the emotions of that moment and transcend them with the curiosity, basically, of an adolescent,
Totally.
right? Where,
Totally.
where
No,
things are being sent to you for the very first time. And we know what a surprise that is, because that shit shouldn't be happening to you. You know,
totally.
right? So
Totally.
it's like to be able to be involved and to be able to back off. Yeah, I think that's amazing, and it's. But still, nonetheless, here's something that I have to ask you about. You
Yes,
talked
heavy.
about collaboration between you and Ramel, but what was that really like? Because he's a brilliant artist and an amazing cinematographer in his own right. And
Absolutely.
now, right? And now you're stretching out to embrace his vision. But beyond that, you have to embrace the vision of all the actors whose POV it is. Oh my God.
Totally. It
Amazing.
genuinely terrified because it was like one of those things signing on. Like, I loved Ramel's work. I loved his work as a photographer. So then the stress of like, okay, I'm now doing compositions for someone whose compositions I so deeply admire, is like, man, I really hope I don't mess this up. Was like a constant fear. Even when I signed on, I remember when I got the call that I had gotten the job, like I was so nervous right before, and I was with my wife. And like the moment that I heard that I got the job, I took off the photo. I said I got it, and my face just dropped. And she's like, "What? Like you wanted this. You're really excited about this. And I was like, oh God, now I need to do it. Now I need to actually like live up to Ramel's vision, Ramel's artwork. Like, oh God, like it genuinely, like, I feel like I like sat down and she was like really excited and I was just like in a fugue state, like kind of thinking about what that means. But it was incredible collaborating with him. I think Ramel is so not only brilliant, but he's so kind and he's giving as a
Mm,
collaborator. Like he truly invites his collaborators as equals to the table, and he has a very, very um, kind of focused vision on what he wants, but how to get there, he's really open and really collaborative about figuring that out and about having conversations. Like he's very convincible, like he'll tell you his idea and like there's just so much space to for the whole team to punch any idea up, or when he's hearing it, he's like, no, I just don't think that that's what I'm looking for in this moment, which I think makes him it was fun. Like there was a way in which in this project, it's maybe a little embarrassing to say, but I remember at New York Film Festival at the premiere when Ramel and it had probably been a year and a half since I had seen the movie last, like the last cut since we had finished the color. And so it weirdly was like seeing the movie fresh for the first time in a long time. And I was backstage with Ramel after the movie and I turned to him and was like, hey, this is crazy to say, but like kind of forgot this movie's kind of disturbing. And he started laughing and he was like, I know, I thought the same thing. Where it was like, I kind of forgot that just because it's like, of course we knew that. And we were having those conversations and we built the image with that in mind of exactly when and where we were shooting. But that the process of making the movie was so full of joy. It was so joyful. Like, it was such a pure kind of attempt at something. And there was a way in which everyone on the set fundamentally had to unlearn everything they thought they knew about cinema. Everyone at every level. But everyone, I think the team that Ramel had built, everyone was just so excited about being vulnerable in that way. So then every conversation just felt so exciting sitting down with the makeup artist Ignacio, with the production designer Nora, with the costume designer Brittany. Like all of us would just be like coming up with ideas because again, it's things where it's like in lieu of an establishing shot, how do you get that information across? Because that was a big thing for us in designing the movie. It wasn't that we wanted to like tear down and recreate cinema. It was actually Ramel and I were constantly having conversations almost about cinema at a quantum level of like how do we break down the molecules of cinema to its most subatomic particles, and then how do we rebuild and remodulate those ideas where it's like, okay, we have an establishing shot, and then asking the question, okay, well, what does an establishing shot, why is it important? What does it really convey? And I think then, for example, it would be like, well, an establishing shot is often a wide shot because it's usually about understanding the space as it relates to our protagonist. Are they comfortable in that space? Are they uncomfortable in that space? What's their relationship with the environment that they're now contextualized within? And like kind of to me, I think that's kind of the core you get from a disability shot. But in the lieu of having that, because everything is the point of view, and it can't just be like, this is a wide and let me run into a close-up, then it becomes a conversation of, okay, well, if we still want to have an establishing shot feel to this scene in the movie with the point of view style, it's like, okay, well, maybe then the image is about, walking into a space and the gaze of the camera looks around the room and it sees that there are marble countertops, there's chrome inlay, that the socioeconomics of this space are pretty high. It's pretty
mm,
nice. And as the camera moves towards the counter, the hand of the protagonist goes on the table and we see it in the corner of the frame. And, maybe the cuff of their shirt is frayed, and that probably speaks to the socioeconomics
yeah.
of the view that we're seeing the scene. And that almost then tells you maybe something about the discomfort or lack of comfort between who we're viewing the scene from and the people in the space, and probably the comfort of the people in the space with us as a viewpoint inside of it. And so all of a sudden it's like, trying to get those things that you would get in an establishing shot in a different way. But again, to us, it was always about, I'd like to, answer your earlier question about references. Like funny enough, like almost none of our references were movies that utilize point of view. Almost
Mm.
all of them were movies that were really, really emotionally evocative for both Ramel and I. So, big references were Tree of Life, the movie Ida, the movie Hard to Be a God, The Mirror by Tarkovsky. Like, they were movies that I think had real emotional impressions on us. So then it became a question of, okay, how do we take some of the feelings that we felt in some of these movies and kind of break those ideas down to their more basic particles and then try to rebuild them and regraft them into the language of like this sentient image that we were talking about. But that was always fun and exciting, which I think just speaks to Ramel as a leader. Like, there was one day I was walking to my car, and the head of the Teamsters on the set came up to me and was like, "Hey, someone told me we're shooting this whole movie point of view." And I was like, "Oh yeah." And he's like, "I've worked for 45 years. I've never heard about anything like that." And he's like, "How the hell is that going to cut?" And I was like, "Okay." And I like took out my laptop and I like sat down with him and I showed him some of the camera tests. I showed him some of the like edit tests we had. And I was like, this is kind of what we've been thinking about. Like, how do we form an establishing shot? This is what we're thinking about creating a cut. This is our form of like thinking about an insert so we can still have things to cut into. And he was like, "Okay, all right. I'm seeing this." And he's like, "Tomorrow, do you mind if I like, come up to Video Village?" And I was like, "Yeah, man. Like, I'll have a seat up there waiting for you, man. Like, come up, like, come by my station, like, watch as much as you want." And he was like, "Okay." And literally the following day, like clockwork, he was there sitting by the butter, just looking at it. And I think that the whole movie had that kind of energy where people just had no idea what this thing was because they've just never been asked to do it. Moses Mott, our key rigging grip, an incredible, incredible, incredible grip. Uh, this man would be rigging for 10 hours, and for the first 2 hours of every single day, off the clock, he would just stay on set because he would stand by Video Village and like because he wanted to see how is this rigging going to be interpreted to this point of view. Like,
Oh,
I know
wow.
what I built and I know the design, but like, what's this going to look like? This isn't like anything I've ever kind of had to do. So there was that real excitement, and I think from our camera team to our G&E team, everyone had a real like the actors would come to set days that they weren't called. The background actors would ask to stay when they weren't cut so they could stay by Video Village and just look at the monitor. Like there was this real kind of palpable excitement on the set of people being like, I don't know if this will work or not work, but what the hell are we looking at here? That really felt exciting and kind of made you forget that, oh, right, this movie is actually like, you know, pretty intense.
Hey, I tell you, when you talk about when you guys were standing off stage and you realized how uncomfortable it was, that uncomfortable feeling that you guys convey is so downplayed that it really hits you on an emotional level. It doesn't, you're not getting slapped over the head with it. You know what I'm saying? And that there's a certain power in that. And I just wanted to say that because it's like all of a sudden, like you talked about the frayed collar and the comparisons to the environment that you're in. I mean, that's how you would feel about yourself. But one question that I really want to know, because this is so bold, what was it like to deal with the studio? How were you guys able to convince the studio and the people that are putting up the bread?
I mean, this is like, it's like it isn't just Plan B and anonymous content who like are known for their bold work. It's a studio movie. It's Orion and MGM. And there was a way in which, initially when I started the project, I was like kind of like steeling myself against this, like, it's really gonna be having to convince people, really going to bat for these ideas that Rebel's talking about. It honestly feels insane for me to even say it out loud. There was not a single instance of the movie where we pushed had any pushback on the point of view. Literally not. There is not a single shot we shot ever on the entire production that is in another perspective that isn't point of view. There's not one. There's not a single image on any camera that was shot traditionally in that sense. And honestly, they were amazing. they were amazing and they were excited. Like I remember when we did the show and tell with the studio and like, we had shot some of the camera tests and we shot the camera test 4:3 and we had done body rigs and a few small kind of isolated scenes that Ramel had kind of written just to test out the feeling of this that don't show up in the movie, of just like feeling it out in some of our environments. And so I remember when we were on the call with all of the executives and we play the camera test and then, it finishes and there's just a silence on the call and no one's
Oh,
saying anything.
oh
And
my
I'm like, oh God. And then one of the executives like, okay, like, yeah,
Oh
yeah,
my
this looks awesome. And then everyone was like, yeah, this looks like, and then it was like, I think both Rebel and I were like, "Oh, okay. Like, we almost felt like it's like, okay, we're going to really have to explain why this isn't a mistake and trust us. Like, we're thinking about da 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 da. And like, I think that I will say, I think people really knew because Ramel and I, again, since everything was a oneer, we had in our shot list, like every single pan, tilt, motion, action you see in the movie was premeditated and pre-written. Like ideally the movie has a really almost like freewheeling, very unbound sense to the camera work. But, we kind of thought about it almost like creating jazz, which is to say that I think oftentimes people when they hear that, they
yeah.
think, oh, it's like improvisationally. But really, jazz is actually improvisation within the structure of music. And music is heavily regimented. Music is the sensation of a sonic pattern. The difference between improvisation within rigid structure and just plain improvisation is the difference between a song and just noise. So, there's a way in which people sometimes forget that with jazz, that it's actually that it has to be incredibly rigid so that it can be improvisational. So, towards that, for our approach, we wanted to be incredibly, incredibly meticulous in how we built every single shot and laying out every single action in the frame and how the camera moved so that on the day we never gave the actors mark, we never gave focus marks, and Nora Mendes, our production designer, every day would walk Ramel and I through the space and would say like, hey, here are 10 hero items in this room. These are 10 items that you can interact with, that you can go to, that you can see, and they tell a small story. And during the shot, you can see 10 of them, you can see 3 of them, you can see none of them. But they're all here if you need to find these anchor points. So then that's kind of what we used to, with the shot list, it was kind of meticulously laid out so that if the actor did something different, did something off book, or if we wanted to imbue the shot with a different energy or maybe just give each take a different kind of feeling, then we would find these anchor points to lock onto. And it's almost like those would be places that we would do a solo. And then once the solo was over, we would click back onto kind of the language of the scene that we had laid out in the shot list. So like that was a lot, that was our strategy on how to like imbue the camera with a certain type of, I think that you had said it earlier, like a bit of wonderment and curiosity that which we had a visual manifesto that we wrote down between Sam Allison, the camera operator, Ramel, and I on like the ways to think about operating the camera because as you're saying, like ideally for us it wasn't that we wanted to capture what sight looks like. We wanted to capture what sight feels like, what memory feels like. And so actually it's like it's a different thing. It's not mimicry of our experience because if it was, it's like something like a Steadicam actually would make more sense. But weirdly, when you do those tests, a Steadicam seems out of body. It seems ghostly. Like just due to the visual grammar of cinema, all of a sudden handheld feels more in the body, even though we don't experience movement like that. Like our brain stabilizes information that comes in through our cortex. So in actuality, we actually do live closer to a Steadicam than we do to handheld, but handheld feels real. It feels in the body. It feels present. It feels like, the image is a person. And so, those were kind of the decision making processes of like doing all those camera tests to figure out, no, 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 we don't want it to look like sight. We want it to feel like sight. We want it to feel like, how does the brain create meaning? How does the brain, like, we all know the situation of being in maybe a sketchy or a strange or feeling dangerous situations. Like we understand that because of these micro small subtextual things that our brain picks up on, like, oh, this person's kind of moving erratically, like, oh, weird, like there's no light on in the back of the room, like, oh, this other person's not making eye contact with me. And it's like those things then form this feeling of, oh, this, I shouldn't be here right now. And I think it was trying to create a camera language that takes you through that experience. So it isn't seeing what the boys are seeing, it is experiencing the world as they're experiencing it, which is to say that you are invited into the very process of how do they understand meaning, because again, it's a period of the Jim Crow South where you're just one is constantly navigating, is this situation dangerous, is it not dangerous, how dangerous is it, and how do I navigate through it, especially as a black body. But I think that exactly as what you're saying, I think for Amel and I, one of the first things he said is like, I don't want to see any violence on camera in this movie. Like, that's unimportant to me. We
Mm,
have those images. So
nice.
actually, everyone knows that those images exist. So I don't think it's about showing the audience, like, look at how terrible this is. Like, actually, I think for us, it was about making a movie that was more about people living in the system, which, like all things, like, and the strangeness of humanity is, even in inhumane situations, people still laugh. They still make jokes. They
Yeah.
still play music. They still fall in love. Like, actually, even despite inhumanity, there are so many beautiful, mundane, and small moments that make up a person's life. And, like, I think that was a lot more of our focus in this movie than kind of like beating you over the head with the brutality and how awful everything is, and like, making it like a message or something. I think it's more maybe a camera style that formally, ideally, hopefully invites the audience to immerse themselves into an experience and a time period that they either might know or might not know. But to again just ask themselves the questions of like, oh, how would that feel? And also like, what are the events in my life that inform who I am, rather than, maybe another type of movie where it's all about teaching you the brutality. But I think that, it also has a doubling effect where it's like, I think of a movie like White Ribbon by Hanukkah, where it's like, the scene when the young boy goes into the room and the door closes and you just hear that he's getting beaten. There's a way in which that's actually more brutal than seeing a scene of someone getting beaten, because it actually invites your imagination into the moment, into the scene. And I
Right.
think that that was a lot more of our strategy with this movie. Wasn't like trying to bum anyone out or beat them over the head with certain images, but just to invite them to just the strange duality of that period in American history. Just has a strange duality where these things are happening, and it's a Jim Crow, it's a segregated South. But we're also putting men on the moon. Like, to imagine what the human brain is thinking about when a child is in that society and knows that they have to get off of the sidewalk if someone looks a different way than them. And we are able to literally have people floating in space. Like, that's
I love
like
it.
how the human brain holds that. That's science fiction. And I think that's really fascinating. And I think that that's really human. Human. Like, I think our ability to reconcile the irreconcilable is like one of the things. I don't think it's our opposable thumbs. I think it's our ability to reconcile the irreconcilable that actually makes us a specific species.
Yeah. The presence of the potential to violence
Mm,
you have to that we had to live through, and to be able to find joy in those days like Elwood does, with the
totally.
potential of violence at any moment. I mean, that's like not that hard to conceive for me, but I mean, it's difficult to conceive what it's like
Totally.
to live, grow up, have fun, pick a piece of fruit off someone's yard, and know that that could lead to anything. You know what I'm saying? I
Totally.
mean, I know that feeling. But here's the other thing too: is I'm sure people would like to know a little bit about the tests you did, the choice of cameras, because there's a lot of cameras employed, and also the support systems, because some of those shots seem so difficult. I mean, like the one you just described of looking under the bus, looking under the seat of the bus. I was like totally blown away by that. And something like the POV of the bicycle, the hands on the handlebars. There's just so many things there that make you wonder. And not only that, is they didn't take me out of the film. I didn't suddenly feel
Mm.
like I'm looking at a camera trick because I'd already become engrossed as being that character. You dig what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. That was kind of that was the profoundly interesting thing about this movie is, again, as you're saying, ideally by design, and our hope was that the images never felt tricky or
Yeah, right.
impressive or clever, that ideally they should feel obvious. Like, they should feel obvious to how the camera should be moving. But like the funny thing was the orchestration of all those things. Like, for this shot, and for example, this bus shot of when the young girl like comes between his legs, and he looks between his legs underneath the bus, like, it was a period bus. So then we basically took out every single chair inside of the bus. We lifted a dolly and dolly track into the bus. We then affixed the dolly track to the bus structure itself, put the dolly on. We then had a remote head, a mini Libra, underslung on the dolly. And we basically put that in front of the actor, and we put the remote head in mimic mode, so I could be doing handheld in another space. So I was at the back of the bus, and so that way I could look down on my body with my mimic rig, and then the camera head would look down on the actor's body. But it was like all of us were on comms. The Callie Riley, our incredible first AC, our dolly grip, like everyone was on comms, and basically the move was as the bus is driving, it was having the dolly operator push forward slightly and then boom down. But again, it's the weird things where it's like to boom down, our head is really heavy.
Yeah.
And when our head goes off the axis of our body, all of a sudden our head becomes very heavy and it drops fast. But then the muscles start tightening up and they slow down the fall. So, it's for the dolly operator, is actually having him to unlearn everything he knows about doing a good booming motion. So the motion had to be slow and then really fast and then abrupt stop and then like start slowing down into the motion, because that's what happens with our head and our own neck. And then the focus has to be moving as our brain thinks of something we should be seeing. So all of us are on comms, and it was like, all right, now cue this. Now cue the boom down. Now feather to a stop, and now shift the focus. And so it was like a funny thing where, again, the shot ideally feels like whatever. It's kind of what you're seeing. But, it was like so much orchestration between maybe five people on the bus for that shot of like, and again, it's a weird thing where as a trick shot, it is every single viewer of this movie is hyper literate on what point of view actually looks like. It's how we experience our entire lives. So there's a weird way in which if a thing is genuinely a quarter of a second off, it feels uncanny. It feels weird. It feels wrong. It doesn't, like, something happens. So it was a funny thing where it was like, for even moments like that or actions like that, you couldn't be a quarter of a second off. Like
Right.
literally, if the focus was a quarter of a second off, you were reminded that it's a camera. If the boom was too fluid, you were reminded that it was a camera. And it was the thing where it's like, if the boom was too fluid, actually, that's a really beautiful shot. A shot that would work in 99.999% of movies and be a really wonderful shot. It would be a good take. I would ask the script soup to circle it. But on this movie, if the boom was perfect but the focus was off, it felt like a camera and it felt wrong. It felt weird. So that was kind of the interesting game throughout this entire movie, was that kind of everyone needed to be meticulous in hitting these marks, even though the movie feels like it is like so free floating. It feels like it's like, oh, natural light and just kind of going with it. It in practicality was like usually very, it was trick shots, but in terms of the camera that we shot it with, we shot on the Sony Venice, which was incredible and I think was such an important camera to shoot this movie, just because of having Rialto mode where you could shoot just the camera block and split the camera braid to another space on an umbilical cord. Like it was so modular, and we
Yeah.
really needed a camera system that was heavily adaptable and it could flip between these things, because it's also a thing that we would start finding out during camera tests, like, okay, some things it's important to have the camera on the shoulder feeling like it's connected to a spine. It feels like it's connected to a body moving through space.
Right.
But
Right.
then other times when it's more about how the neck articulates, the camera needs to be able to articulate really quickly to different angles. And there's a way in which that's kind of how our neck moves, and putting it on our shoulder, it's kind of too hard to get those angles quickly. So then it became about shooting the camera in Rialto mode and having the grip run with the brain on the proton pack so that you could get that type of motion. So it's like things where it's like each seed would call for different things. And Callie Riley, our first AC, would have a laminated chart on the camera cart that had the seed and it had the camera apparatus or whatever build it was in. So we had two camera teams, and honestly, it was like two camera teams, even though most of the movie was shot single camera. It was having two teams just so that we had multiple configurations of the camera so we could jump into it at any time, and so that we had backups for every scene. Because again, it's a situation where if the body rig or the chest rig is even an inch off, it feels uncanny. So it was a thing where it's like it really was dependent on being on the actors on that day, that morning with that costume that you kind of finally got a look of what it would look like, just because small imperceptible differences actually made a really big difference for us. So we shot on the Sony Venice. The lenses were the Panavision VAs, which at that point were still prototypes and kind of were completely redesigned by Dan Sasaki. And so it was like as we were shooting the movie, Dan was sending us prototypes like as they were coming off the bench. He would be
Wow.
sending them being like, hey, like, send any notes about this 40 if like something needs to change. And they were able to also make us a set of custom 300, 400, or 500 mil primes as well in kind of the VA language, but they were incredible. Like one of my reps in in New Orleans, Steve Kroll, like I was like doing a camera test, and like as I was leaving, he was like, "Hey, I think maybe you should check out these lenses. They're still prototypes, but based on the things you're talking about, I think you might like them." And I was like, "Well, like I feel like I know what I'm liking, and I know what I'm like not interested in. I test a lot when I'm not shooting. Like both of my parents are scientists, and I think that that part of me I definitely inherited, and that I am obsessive about testing. So I'm like, well, I test a lot of things when I'm not shooting, so I feel like yeah, I probably don't need to see it. And I was like, okay, let me just throw it on the camera. And I think what I texted Ramel 5 minutes later was, quote, I think I just saw God in this lens. Like
Oh,
it was something I had never really seen before. The way the VAs are able to capture volume is incredible. Like, and it isn't that it's three dimensional. It's a weird thing to describe. Like, I don't know how to describe it aside from saying that, like, you feel volume, you feel the size and the sense of the space. And I think that through our camera test became such a large part of Nickel Boys was that it's like things where it's like, there are scenes that take place when Elwood is 6 years old. There are scenes that take place when he's an adult man. There are scenes that take place when he's a teenager. But for the young scenes of Elwood when he's like really young at 3 or 6, you're tempted to think that when you're really young, it's about being short. It's about looking up to a taller world. But it's not that. It's actually that when you're young, you are small relative to the size of the world. That adults look like giants. They tower over you because of their perspective to you. And I think that there's a thing where it's like, a scene like, your grandmother having a sheet of the bed above you, it needs to feel like that sheet could envelop the entire world. Like that's
wow.
larger than life. Like there's a sense of scale that is
Yeah.
really attached to being young. So then when I saw these lenses, it was like I felt scale. I felt small when I was on some of them. I felt large when I was on other ones, and that thing I think really excited Ramel and I. They're also incredibly lightweight and incredibly fast, and so we shot full frame on the Venice and shot the lenses primarily wide open, which Callie Riley again, our first AC, was the one of the first calls that I made when I got the job, and I told her the things. I was like, yeah, so I'm thinking about doing this movie where it's all point of view. I'm thinking about not giving the actors any marks. I'm thinking about primarily shooting wide open so we can kind of again just separate everything as they're seeing the world one at a time. And I was like, and I'm not going to give you any focus marks, and I'm not going to give the actors any marks. And then she was quiet on the phone, and I was like, so it'd kind of be like our Olympics. How does that feel to you? And she was like, I'm in. And once I got that from her, I was like, okay, like we can do this thing. But she was incredible. Literally, despite the insanity of that, literally, I don't remember a single time in the entire shoot we had to go again because of focus. Like Callie was tack sharp for everything. And what I love about her is she has a sense of cinema. Like I never have to tell her where I want to put the focus. I want her to watch the scene. I want her to read the script, know the emotions that every scene, every shot we're doing, so that when she's pulling focus, she's making those decisions on the fly. I think it's Christopher Doyle who once said that, as cinematographer, we are the first audience. And I think that's incredibly true. And I think that the focus puller is also one of the first audiences. I think the camera operator is one of the first audiences. And I think it's empowering her to just make decisions. Like, if it feels more emotionally true to rack to the background when we're looking at this close up of this person, just do it. Just do it. And if it feels wrong, or afterwards the director and I are like, actually, we would rather be on, we'll just have that conversation. We can do another take. But like, I always feel like if I'm saying into the comms, like, go to her hands, we're already late. We should have been at her hands the moment I thought about it, not the moment I said it out loud. And I think what's so incredible about Callie is like, you can trust her to be autonomous. She sees the cinema, she just goes there. And I think for both Ramel and I, that's what we were looking for, is we wanted to find those, ineffable things, those ineffable qualities, those things that make explaining life so hard to explain, rather than, like, again, these spectacles relationships to the image. I think that Johnny actually said it earlier, and I think there's so much truth to that. It was, you know when the camera in the movie hugs Audrey, it's me she's physically hugging, or it's Sam Ellison, our camera operator, she's physically hugging. Something different happens there when that happens. I think that there's a way in which, I like to think anecdotally that all of us, the way that all of us would photograph our mothers are completely different to how anyone else in the world would photograph them. And I think that we all realize that quality. We know it. And whether it's your mother or your partner, there's a way in which when you photograph someone that you love, the image changes. What you see in the image changes. Your composition changes. It fundamentally does, because you are bringing to bear all of the complexities of this relationship, and you're trying to see them in the image. I think that was something Rebel would kind of muse on a lot during production. Like, he would often rhetorically ask us, like, what would the world look like if every image taken was taken as if the person taking it was looking at their mother, their sister, their brother, their friend. Like, what would happen to the world? What would happen to politics? What would happen to everything if every image was an image that was shot as if from a place of love or understanding of everyone else? Like, what would happen? And I think that that was kind of the profound challenge with this movie, but also what was exciting about it, because in this scene where it's like, it can't be Sam or Jomo hugging Ingenue. It becomes, because you're operating the camera thinking as Elwood, thinking as Turner, it then becomes, in the instances of maybe Elwood and Hattie, it's not that I'm hugging Ingenue. It's that I, Elwood, am hugging my grandmother, someone I love, someone who's transferring love into me when we embrace. Like, there's something that changes when you're in that headspace, that when you compose that person after you release the hug, that composition's different, because you're thinking about them as a family member. You're thinking about someone that you connected. Even just having that physical intimacy, quite literally the haptic connection of receiving a hug from someone during the scene. There was a scene on, actually, Ingenue's first day of shooting, where she comes to the school and has a hard conversation with Elwood, and she has to deliver some pretty bad news to him. And I was watching Ramel rehearse with Ethan Harisi, the actor who plays Elwood, and seeing him rehearse with Ingenue, and they were like finding the scene, and I was watching how Ethan was experiencing it, how he was performing it in that. Um, and then when I came in and shooting the scene, as the scene is getting up to that point, I can kind of feel it. You can feel when a person is like kind of trying to prepare you to say something difficult, to have to say something difficult. And me as Jobo, it's so difficult for me to maintain eye contact with someone when I feel like they are telling me something that devastates them to have to say to me. Like, it's so hard seeing that in a person's eyes. And so as we were shooting the scene, and as I'm thinking as Jomo as Elwood, in that moment, as I feel she's about to say it, I kind of look away, and in looking away, the camera kind of drifts away. And it got quiet, and Ingenue put her hand out, and she said, totally off book, she says, Elwood, look at me, son. And, like, something happened there where I was like, uh, oh shit. I need to reestablish the gaze. She has asked me. And I am like almost thinking it was like Hattie had asked Elwood, no, you need to look in my eyes when I tell you this news. I need to take responsibility for what I'm saying, and I need you to see that happen. Like, we need to connect while I'm telling you this thing, even though I know it's hard to hear. And I think when cut was called, I like ran to the monitor, and Rebecca and I were like, "What just happened there? Like, what was that?" And I think it was this like kind of excitement that I think at that moment it was when this idea of point of view, this idea of sentient image, it flipped. It became something different. I think that when we were talked about it, when we had done the test, it was again this idea that we've been talking about like immersion, about bringing you into a hyper subjective kind of different intimate relationship with the protagonist. But when Anjanou said that, and when the camera was forced to change its plan because the camera was a scene partner, the camera's scene partner said, "I need you to look at me at this moment." The camera couldn't just be shooting these emotions. The camera had to be vulnerable. And it had to be as vulnerable as Turner in that moment. It wasn't just that we were showing that Turner feels bad. Actually, it's in that moment that it's like, no, we need to feel this so that we can accurately emotionally respond and go off book with the actors. And again, those are the moments where, we welcomed improvisation into it. But that was the moment I think the image changed for Rebel and I, where it's like, oh, this perspective is actually crazy, not just because it's inside the scene, but actually because the scene can change it. That if someone hits the camera, the image turns off. If someone asked the camera to look at something, you have to look at it. It would be weird and not human like if someone said, "Hey, look at this thing," and you were like looking up. Like, you kind of have to do it. And because we didn't give the actors that kind of confinement, they could ask those things. So as an operator and as a cinematographer, you need to meet that challenge, which I think is one of the things I feel so deeply, deeply, deeply grateful for as an artist doing this project, because it truly is something that has left me fundamentally changed with how I make images past this movie forever, for the rest of my life. Like, that feeling, like, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. Like when Ajinu said, like, "Look at me, son," it was like the image felt like a different thing. And I think trying to imbue images with ideally, hopefully in my career, I've tried to have the camera have an emotional connection with the scene, to have a level of vulnerability, openness. And so it isn't just voyeuristically capturing actors feeling, but it's trying to capture a subjective, being harmonious with them. But I think that this moment of this project was different. It was past that. It was this other thing where it isn't just you're trying to show vulnerability, you're trying to feel it. It is you actually needed to put up or shut up. Like, you kind of needed to be a scene partner, which meant that you had to be reactive in kind of a different way than I think I traditionally think about it. And that was, yeah, it was humbling. It was humbling, but I'm so grateful that all of these actors were so incredible, so giving, so kind to invite camera into that process, because this is their stage. Like, once action's called, like, it's their show. Like, we are here to support them, to see them, to witness them, but like, this is actually their domain. So for them to like be open to bringing us into that as partners, it was profound, man. Like, it really was. I'm so thankful for all of the actors for that. They really were all so giving in that way, and so like excited by the challenge, even though it was a profound challenge. Like, for Angelina to look into the lens, it isn't just that she's looking into the lens, which traditionally means kind of looking past the lens down the center of the lens. But for this, she had to look into the lens and see her grandson. Like, it's almost like the gaze had to drop at the lens. It had to fall. It had to be connected to the camera as an organ, as a human being. It wasn't just I'm looking into the camera. It had to be that she's looking with love that is channeling into that camera. Even though every single time, like, the other actor was often like cheek to cheek with Sam Ellison, Rebel, or I as operators, like, we're really close as they possibly could be. We would often have, all of us would have the costume of the actor, so that if we were doing handheld, we can look down and see our own body, or we could put our hands up and have the actor sneak his hands underneath, and we can look down at our own body and see their hands in front of us. Like, it was always trying some trick to get that perspective. But the actors, whenever the shot was taken, whoever's perspective it was, the actual actor was always incredibly close, to the point that for most of the movie we were cheek to cheek, quite literally. Like, not like in hyperbole, like, oh, we were so close. Like, genuinely, like, Ethan and Brandon's face were just pressed up to mine so they could get as close an eye line, and so they could have the haptic connection with the other actor. They could reach their hand out even if it wasn't in frame and touch the other actor, so they still felt like there was a real human they were looking into, even if they were looking into the camera. But again, that's I just am so moved and blown away by their work as performers to be able to like bring a quarter of the emotion they brought to something that literally challenges every rule they have been taught from their youngest age as an actor to work with. Like, don't look into the lens, don't look at the camera. And if you have to look at the camera, like, don't imbue it as a human. Your scene partner is actually across from the camera. Like, it was wild. And they were amazing.
Yeah, man, I don't know what's going on technically over here. But as I was saying, I don't know
No.
if you got that, but it just feels like love was such a motivating factor in all of these performances and the approach of with the camera. You just, as you used the word tenderness, it felt, I could feel that tenderness. And believe me, I know what it's like to look through a camera and feel love, because that's pretty much what we always do when we look through a camera, but this is different.
Yes, totally.
So,
No, yeah.
no, one more thing to go
Mhm.
off that for a second. You use a lot of different cameras in this film. Can you tell us about those?
Of course, yes. I think first before telling you is that, oh, I really love that. And I love that also in the question that was asked by Will. I think that there's a connection between Johnny's question and that. And, it's that feeling of love. It's a funny thing. I think that it was never anything thought technically. I think it's Eve Arnold who says that it's the photographer, not the camera, that's the tool. It's our ability to see compassionately that changes the image, to see and witness the subject that allows the
Right.
subject to show us something about themselves. I think that cinematography, I think all image making, exactly as you're saying, Johnny, I think is an act of love. Like it has to be, even if you're looking at someone who's deplorable, I think it's still the opportunity of the image is the opportunity that language doesn't always give us, is that ideally the opportunity to see without prejudice, to see openly. And towards that, like how doing that, to me, it always just comes back to an emotional thing, like not a technical thing. Like I didn't use like portrait lenses or different lenses when I was doing that. It was always about trying to just see someone. And like, this sounds a little bit corny, but I oftentimes feel like I become a better cinematographer, like not when I log more hours on a gearhead. Like that's important, like super important. And I think technical prowess is a huge part of this craft. It is an important part of this craft. But I think that for me personally, as Jomo, I usually feel like I become a better cinematographer after an argument with my partner when I am forced to see the world through her eyes. And I'm forced to understand that I might have been wrong or I might have had my own prejudices coming into the argument. I feel like I'm a better cinematographer when I'm a better son, when I'm a better brother, when I'm a better friend, when I'm more compassionate, when I'm genuinely pushed to challenge my own views. I feel like the next time I come to set, I see images I didn't see before. I see things that I didn't see before, which I think is something I feel so grateful for this craft for, is that to me it always feels like the more we open ourselves up, the more vulnerable as people we are, I think the images
Exactly.
just get better. The images just, it keeps stacking, it keeps compounding. Because ultimately, for me personally, cinematography, art, period, to me is all about, it is confusing being a human. Can we try to express that, and can we connect? Can we see each other? Can we hear each other? Can we actually form a communication beyond language, something deeper? So yeah, I think that was kind of, I guess, like how I thought about doing that. Like that genuinely was kind of the ideation process. It was never nothing ever changed technically. Anytime we wanted the image to feel like it was really loving and tender and connecting, it was all about just like the mind state of trying to shoot an image that connects. But to your question of camera, like
But
technically,
one
like the
second,
different
really
cameras we
quickly.
used. Mhm,
Jomo, it's about
mhm.
being able to see with the heart. You know, you began to see with your heart. You don't, your eyes become the extension of your heart. You know, and that's what you guys convey, and that's what, photographers and cinematographers grow into. We want to be able to see with this, and
Mm,
technology becomes an extension of our hearts, and I think that you guys did that. It's powerful in that sense that you feel like you're not looking intellectually,
Mm,
you're looking emotionally. All your past, everything that has ever made you who you are, is creating that image, and it's coming from someplace deep. And I have to applaud you for that because it's nothing you try and do. It's you can't make yourself do that.
mm. Oh my God, I absolutely love that. I agree so wholeheartedly, and thank you. That genuinely means so much for of all people to hear you say that. Oh yeah, that means a lot.
But
But no,
that
I totally
it,
agree.
it
I think
means
it's with seeing with the heart.
here's what it is too. I tell you, it's like when you go to the museum and you fall in love with a painting. You see beyond the frame. And that's what it is
Yes,
when you produce something from the heart. You see beyond the frame. There's something else that expands that frame that isn't visual, and
totally.
I just love that. I see that. I mean, it totally stops you. So good, Jomo. And you know what I really love? Is
Totally.
you're making so many things
Hmm.
so clear. It's like, like
Oh, well, thank you so
so much.
much.
No,
I
really,
mean, so
why?
many
Why are
conversations
people?
we've had over the years.
I tell you, man, it's like you're sharing something with so many people that you're making so clear, and it's just wonderful that you can talk about it, because there's a lot of musicians and painters, and cinematographers. They can't express it, they can't put those things into words, but it's good. You're doing a good
Mm,
job of that. I tell you, I appreciate it. It really hits
mm,
me emotionally to hear you describe these things. It's good. It's good.
mm.
It's almost
Oh,
like
thank you
we're
so
not
much.
talking cameras.
Totally.
Hey,
Totally.
Rob,
But that's the thing. That's what got me into In the Mood for Love, is that thing that's beyond what lenses they used. It was
oh
something
yeah,
something else
oh yeah,
entirely, what they were capturing.
exactly.
The magic
I feel
trick.
so stupid saying something about influence on the lighting. Who cares? It's like,
Hey, I get it. I love lighting too. I love lighting instruments.
but the lighting that tells the story. Hey, Raul, can you just send us through a couple of those pictures of those setups that you showed us earlier? Some of those
Yeah.
S
BTS. Yeah.
photographs. So, I mean, there's a lot of really experienced cinematographers on here, I'm sure, but there are a lot of people that are very curious about just how
Mhm.
things were accomplished. Just can you show us some of those because some of the lighting setups were just kind of interesting.
Yeah. We had a truly, truly, truly brilliant, brilliant team, like genuinely one of the best teams I've ever worked with. Bob Bates, the gaffer, was incredible. Like, Bob just has such a deep sensitivity to light and such a curious and excited expression of that. Like, he always had another idea to use in. Gary Kelso, our key grip, was also incredible, incredible, incredible. Like, a lot of the custom body rigs they had to build for the actors for some of the camera shots, a lot of the techniques we used, they had to engineer. And Gary knew I loved mirrors, and so he actually bought a set of the CRLS light bridge, like 4x4 mirrors. So we had an extra set of those. We had a ton of mirrors. And Gary and his team also built me a set of custom mirror designs. So we also used the Dado Eflect, where it's like kind of smaller and almost like a flattened disco ball that you could create really textured qualities of light. And Gary and his team built me 4x4 versions of the Eflect so that we could bend and flex. And like that was a huge approach to our lighting. We always wanted like something that Gary, Bob, and I always talked about is wanting quality diversity, in the sense of both hard light and soft light, and maybe like somewhere mixed in between. Like every shot, we always wanted as many different types of quality as possible. Because to me, that's what real life kind of feels like. It's never just one source. It's like, oh, there's a hard slash on the back, but it's really soft here because it's bouncing off of the curtains. But then there's like some dappled light here in this other part of the room because there are trees in the back of the house. So it was always about quality diversity and also exposure diversity, where we always wanted to have a dark part and a bright highlight in every image. Like, almost thinking in terms of the zone system is like something I do a lot on set. I usually use a Pentax Spot Meter 5, I believe, which kind of goes off of the zone system that Ansel Adams invented,
Oh,
which I kind of love because it forces you to look at the frame in terms of like the different densities inside of the image and trying to expand that as much as you can. And cameras are incredible with their dynamic range these days, but also like again, to me it's about real images. To me, whenever I'm in any room, there's always, like inside of this hotel right now, there's like a bright part of it, there's also really dark black corners, there's also things that are kind of in the midtones, grays, and like having every image ideally have the most of that. And also diversity of texture was a
mm.
really important thing for us too, where it's like, we wanted big broad slashes of light, we wanted soft pushes of light, and then we wanted, almost like the mistakes that we clean up. So we would put like small mirrors underneath a windowsill, or we would put like a cucoloris or a branchioloris above a mirror to, like, again, like break things up, or put a fan underneath a window and push a light through it so that still there was movement. There was a sense that the light, even on the back wall, was like breathing or undulating. I think is something that I love when light moves, which is also why I love mirrors, is that, if you're crazy enough or irresponsible enough maybe to light a scene with like 10 mirrors around a building, and a cloud passes in front of the sun, there's a moment in the scene where, because every single light unit is connected to one source in the sky, it's like everything kind of dims and then everything comes back up once the cloud passes. And there's something about that, like, I'm thinking about Thin Red Line. Like, I love all those moments in the movie where you feel physics, where you feel time,
Oh,
where you
yeah.
feel light changing, and it isn't locked in every shot, but you feel things kind of breathing, are things that we really love. So yeah, so Gary, Bob, and the team were so incredible because, I said these conceptual things to them, and it was like talking about the type of units I like and the types of ways I like working with the lighting. And, they both just always came with so many ideas, things that I never thought about, to push that idea forward. And so it really was just such an exciting collaboration, because I feel like we all just learned from one another. And again, it was just a place where we were doing something that we all knew we had never been asked to do before. There was even a shot really early on in the movie that sadly does not make the edit, but was a shot of Elwood sitting on a bench, and you're seeing his chest and his body, and you're seeing him hold a briefcase. And Ramel, for the scene he wanted, that Elwood's sitting there and he's looking at the ground, and we see a hard outline of his shadow, and then a cloud passes and you see his shadow dissipate on the ground, and then you see the cloud pass again and you see the sharp shadow come back out, was actually the first shot we did on day one. And it's like, it's those funny things with this movie where it's like, you see that in the script, and it's like 3 lines of like, Elwood sits feeling time, and a cloud passes, his shadow is out, and then his shadow softens, his shadow comes back, was like something that we had to use multiple condors to kind of fade between each other, like different solid, like we had mirrors pushing the sun down, and then like
Wow.
silk, the different solids on condors kind of moving through the motion so that the shadow kind of passed naturally, and also kind of changed the quality of like a pretty large area. We had a body rig on Elwood so that you can't see the outline of the camera, so the shadow's clean. But it was like things like that with this movie where it's like, it was about trying to create a shot that felt simple, and a shot that we all know. We've all experienced that when we're sitting and we can see just the sun change. And it's not something that we link in on, but it's something that we experience. And I think for us, that scene at the time was more about just the feeling of sitting in time. But again, technically, all of a sudden, it's like that those simple 3 lines becomes, a set of meetings for weeks, and a set of tests of like, okay, like, let's do a small scale model. Can we create, even with like small flags, the feeling of the sun kind of moving, so that you're not seeing these blunt edges of like a solid and then a silk, so the lighting totally changes, and then a solid again, where it's like they need to fade between one another naturally. Again, these are the kind of things that Gary and Bob were faced with, for weeks in prep and throughout the production of just like being asked to do things that why the hell would they ever have been asked to do that before? But they really were just so incredible and creative and thoughtful and excited collaborators that I feel so blessed to have had them and their entire team. The rigging team, exceptional. But yeah, that was a lot of kind of the idea about the lighting is that we wanted it to be primarily an interpretation of single source lighting where we would do really broad kind of strokes. And again, we knew we wanted to light spaces, not faces, because we never gave the actors any marks. We wanted them to feel free in the space. So it was always about building the lighting into the environment and building the lighting into the sets in a way that it felt authentic. There's a way in which, again, there's just so much that's happening in this movie that it was important. And there's so much artifice and just people looking into the camera, the first person of it all. For us, the lighting was always about having, what I would maybe call a certain level of honesty to it. And I
Mm,
think that that's hard for me to even define what that really means, but
yeah.
that I didn't want it to ever feel too big or expressionistic, but I wanted it to feel because so much of this, like we would ask ourselves, like, who would Elwood and Turner be if they were alive today? And I feel like Ramel and I kind of kept being like, I think they would be visual artists or filmmakers. Like, there's a way in which they see their world aesthetically. Like, they see, like, to us, it was always about, like, okay, if we gave Elwood and Turner a camera and we gave them, a small DSLR, what documentary would they shoot about their lives in the Jim Crow South? And so that was to
Hmm.
us what kind of the meta story of what Nickel Boys is like as if they were capturing it. So like, yes, it would be these like really strange moments, but also it would be like, oh man, it's really beautiful the way the light kind of moves through this curtain. That's really pretty. And it reminds me of like being in my grandmother's house because you could smell her food in the kitchen, you could hear gospel play, and you see this light just playing against the carpeting in the back room that you're always sitting in. Like that's part of life. That's a memory. That's a core memory that Rebel and I definitely both shared. So yeah, the lighting was meant to try to invoke those things, but it was again a funny thing, like the entire process of this movie, where ideally it looks like everything was just shot naturally, or like, oh, that's what we had when we showed up there. And there was one day where Ramel walked to set for during the infirmary, and he walked in and he was like, "Oh my God, this looks great! Like we did such a good time planning out when to shoot this. Like the wind is blowing, the light is pushing in the back of the wall. There are all these like weird hits all over the room, just light bouncing around things, and like a big soft source and a slash in the back." And he's like, "This is great. We got to shoot this quick so we could get this in the can before this moves." And then Bob just looked at me and smiled, and he was like, Bob was like, "Do you want me to ask him to pan it away?" And I was like, "Yeah, ask him to just pan away the main mirror and to turn off the electricity for a second." And it was like we panned it away, the room just fell into like abject darkness, and Rel's like, "Whoa, what happened?" And it was like, all of that was this is all created. Like the wind you're seeing blowing through, there are fans underneath all of the windowsills pushing into like none of this is real. And I was like, so you got the time you need to get whatever performance you need here because literally almost all of this is fake. And he was just like as a photographer, again, as a photographer who does his own work, and like he's not looking at the design of these things. It's like, and because all the lighting's happening outside, it's just like, oh, this is a room where it looks really good. And I feel like he like totally lit up after this moment. He was like, okay, all right, you know what? Let me dip my lip from here on out. And but again, that really speaks to I think Bob and Gary's work, like really exceptional. They were
Jomo,
such an asset.
Jomo, what was the shooting schedule of this thing?
That's a great question. It was about 30 days.
What?
Um, yeah. Um, and unfortunately, we ended up losing a bunch of days because of COVID at the beginning of the production. Um, so, again, this is like the weird things where it's like the movie was actually pretty lean and mean because it was like we just had to get through a lot of things. And it's those things where, again, the simplicity of saying, a shadow passes behind Elwood and then the sun comes back out. That's three lines and can be 5 hours, of
Right.
like a lighting setup and pre-rigging. So, yeah, I think that was also why Ramel and I like it was so important for us to really have a meticulous and super planned out kind of approach for the film coming into prep, coming into production. Was that he and I had just spoken at the point that we started day one. He and I had had genuinely 150 hours of conversation on weekends, on weekdays after work, during work, isolated meetings of just everything, like the emotion every scene needs to have, every beat, where the camera needs to see, how it needs to see. And because he's already a visual artist and a photographer and a great one, it's like, he holds in his head every composition, like every transition needs to feel photographic. For him, coming from a visual practice, he was like, no, 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 like your transitions can't be just moving. Like I need to be able to pause this movie at any moment. It needs to stand as a singular image. It needs to feel like my work as a still photographer, as a still image. Like even if we're looking down at her feet while we're talking, how that is composed needs to feel like it's telling a story of this
I
person.
love it. I love it.
So, it was just planning, 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 and testing.
There's a
Hey,
question.
we
Oh, sorry. Go
gotta do
ahead,
some
John.
questions.
Yeah,
Hey,
there's a question that kind of piggybacks off of what you just said, Jomo, and I'm just going to read it here. I can only imagine the amount of director DP collaboration that goes into a film like this. How did you go about the initial conversations to get up to speed so fast as first time collaborators? What percentage of time do you feel spent together in person versus over calls or Zooms? And what other advice do you have for getting past the jargon and into the deeper conversations?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that what felt so exciting about this collaboration, and that I'll speak more generally, is that like the first 2 hours of our first initial like my interview, Rumel and I were just talking about philosophy, and then at the end of it was like, oh my god, right, I'm making this movie and this is kind of what I'm thinking, and I was like, oh, okay. But like it felt so exciting because it genuinely, I didn't know someone like Rumel existed. Like it almost feels like he and I had been living parallel lives of like very ominous experiences that we shared, and also books that we were always reading. So like it was it was so exciting because this was a unique opportunity in that it felt like we got up to speed almost immediately, and both of us were like too excited to get things out because we were like, oh my god, you also have been thinking about the image like this for like decades, and like finally someone is like, we can just like get into it. But I think that generally speaking, and also what happened here too, is like the way I try to get around jargon is that I think it's more important for me personally to like go out to dinner with the director, to like hang out, to like not talk about the movie, but to understand their life, to understand, their feelings about love, to understand, having conversations about family. Like to me, it's like as a cinematographer, I think about what we do. We're almost like translators. And like, I'm talking a lot right now, but I feel like the job really is, to me at least, a lot more about listening than it is about talking. It's about listening to the script. It's about listening to the cinema, listening to the actors, listening to the director's vision, listening to the director. Like I feel like it's more like channeling that through and protecting it, where I almost like to think that ideally my job is translating what a director's thinking in terms of mood, tone, and emotion, and translating that into lenses, camera movement, color, feeling. Um, More than anything. So to me, it's just so important to listen to them and also to try to get out of being in the technical milieu where like my first conversations with the directors are always like, let's not talk about how the movie should look. Like let's not talk about aesthetics, let's not talk about color, black and white, aspect ratio, but like could we only talk about how do you want your movie to feel? Like tell me three adjectives of feelings, and they cannot be aesthetic, but tell me feelings that you want the project to feel like. How do you want us as an audience to feel watching it? Whose perspective is it from, and what do they feel about their perspective? And usually to me it's about then linking tools to those feelings. And why I do like a lot of camera tests is like I like almost building an internal library in my head of like, oh, these lenses kind of conjure this feeling in me, this color kind of conjures this idea, this filter plus this lighting trick kind of conjures this other thing. And then it's like almost applying some of those like general ideas to specific emotions the director is telling me. And to me that usually helps because then throughout the process, all of a sudden, like when you're on set now, you continue that language, you keep talking emotionally. He or she tells you, this is what I need from this moment. And then it's about, okay, well, how can I translate that? And can I show you something? And like, okay, look at this frame. Does that kind of get to what you're talking about? And they're like, no, it needs to feel more like, there needs to be more loneliness. And it's like, okay, maybe increase the headroom so it feels like things are unharmonious in this moment. And then they could say, oh, I like that, or like, no, it doesn't feel like that. But to me, that's always helpful because it you kind of dodge past getting too bogged down and like, oh, I love a 35 and anamorphic is so incredible. Those things they're important. I love them. And also, I think for me, talking with the director, you could get deeper. And also, like, I love when directors talk to me like actors because all of a sudden they're talking to the actors the same way, they're talking to the image people the same way to me. Then they start harmonizing because there's one way in which this person is interacting here rather than them flipping their brain into like, oh, I'm talking to my technical guy and like, here's what I need for da da da. And they click their brain off of it and they're like, all right, now I'm talking emotion with the actor. Ideally, I want to set a director up to do their best work and to make them feel as strong as they possibly can on set. And in my experience, that's usually been trying to find a shorthand with them that kind of gets to the things I know they're thinking about. They're thinking about the edit, they're thinking about the design, and they're thinking about the feeling. So, like, instead of asking them to talk on our terms, I oftentimes find it more helpful to just like talk on their terms, like make it simpler, but actually more emotionally complicated.
Very
That's
good.
great. Here's another question that I think is interesting. Do you believe that the use of sentient viewpoint in the way that improv is embraced can broaden the gap of human made films and AI created films?
Whoa.
Mm. Oh man.
Take some water.
That's a hard question, man. I don't even know if I can answer that question.
That's a scary question.
Yeah. Here, I'll say this in terms of my thoughts on AI, just generally speaking. I think that you know, it's technological innovation, and whether we like it or dislike it, it will become part of, I think, our industry, how we work, how we think. Societally, I think it'll become part of that conversation. I think it's unfortunate when we think about the spaces in which AI might replace real human jobs. I think that that's heartbreaking, and I think that's something we should really protect against because, I think people's lives, their livelihoods, are important and important to be protected. And I think that there's something that a human adds to something. But for other things where actually it's not about taking someone's job, but it's just saving time for people so that ideally they can think more creatively, they can think more boundlessly because certain more rote tasks are being taken care of. I think that that's interesting, exciting, and maybe an opportunity there. In terms of art and I think that this is maybe a hot take, but I think that humans we are too vain to ever outsource people making work about ourselves. I think that it's like we're interested in cinema not because it's perfect, because it's imperfect, because it's subjective, because it's specific. I think the reason that we have favorite art tours are precisely because we get to see the world through a very specific, singular person and how they move
Mm.
through the world. I think that we as humans are so, again, fundamentally confused about who we are and what we're doing here that that's a conversation of humans between humans. Like, this happened in the 90s when there was like the mathematical art movement and like mathematical paintings. And like that was interesting and it was interesting as a novelty, but it didn't replace paintings or art. And another example of that is like, when in the turn of the century, when the first photograph was photographed, there were a lot of articles that were written on how this is the death of painting. Because at that point, painting was so fundamentally about photorealism that now, like, in the same reason why there would be oil painting portraits, those aren't meant to be paintings, those are meant to be pictures of the people of whose families they are in. And the moment the first tintype photo was taken, even a distorted photographic image, people were like, well, now it's the death of painting. But actually, I would argue that that was the moment that painting actually exploded because painting now didn't need to be interested in photographic reproduction. It could actually be about emotional reproduction, and it could be about expressionism. It could be about the complexities of humanity as seen through these tools. So I think that that is true
Yeah.
here, where like AI is just a tool, but I don't think it'll ever replace because I don't think that's how technology has really worked in the past. If we want to play this game, then theater should be dead the moment the first movie is invented. Why would theater exist? You can have the perfect take. The actors don't need to do it again. It's financially more viable because you only pay them once to do one great performance. And you have a product that you can show time immemorial. Like, why would you do theater? Well, you do theater because something different happens when you're sitting in an audience with actors who are going to do it differently every night. Something different happens. So clearly, as a species, we're not really prioritizing perfection. We prioritize experiences, and I think that that's what makes me, at least, hopefully I'm not saying all of this and it's ignorant or it's naive, but I think that there's something that humans like how other humans think. I just don't really see us ever putting that in the hands of something else. We're kind of too egotistical to do that.
That's so good, Jomo. I like that.
That's a great way to put it.
Hopefully that's not self-protection, but
Yeah,
I believe
Yeah,
it. I genuinely believe
I'm
it.
with you. I like that. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Oh, what
that's a
else we
great.
got?
Um, yeah, let's go to here's another one. In the novel, Whitehead uses pace and language to repeatedly twist the reader's relationship to hope, moving between potential escape and inevitable capture, etc. In what ways did you experience that your experience of that twisting that permeates the novel informed how you framed or twisted, if you will, the ebbs and flows of hope and disappointment in the story visually with the cameras in a cinematic sense?
Yeah. I think it was about trying to just think of, again, the same thing we've been talking about just now, of like trying to think and trying to think deeply and trying to unpack, well, what is the emotion of each of these moments, each of these scenes that Jocelyn and Ramel wrote? And I think that that also goes to Jocelyn and Ramel adapting the book. I almost find, I think about the adaptation maybe close to something. I'm not saying that it's comparable in terms of like quality and like what it has done to cinema, but like I think about like 2001 Space Odyssey, where Kubrick is doing an interpretation of Arthur C. Clarke's book. Even the ideas around the monolith in the book are totally different than they are in the movie. But I think that why I love it in 2001, it's Kubrick not only trying to understand it himself, but he's trying to understand it within the context of cinema. Where a novel, you're inside a person's head. It's objective. Like you know what they're thinking in theory. Like that is kind of the design of the form. In cinema, it's not that obvious because again, there is actually alienation between you as viewer and image. But I love 2001 in especially those monolith scenes because it's Kubrick trying to interpret this idea, think about this idea in his own form. I think that for Ramel and Jocelyn adapting the script from the novel was that same idea of like, they added in a lot of scenes that aren't in the novel. And I almost think about the two pieces as almost supplemental, where it's like, we have the book, and so almost the strategy was like, well, we don't want to just make a one for one of the book, but like to create a supplemental experience that obviously is tied to it and shares a lot of the same DNA, but is reinterpreted into another form that has other things that that form can provide that the other can't, and vice versa. There are things in a novel that we can't really reproduce in film, and I think we often get in trouble when we try to because the artistic forms are just different. They both tell stories. So I think there's a way in which sometimes we think that they're the same, but they're just different. Like how we experience them are different. But towards that question, so I think that Ramel and Jocelyn had built in what they called adjacent images, which were scenes that for them never had a plot significance, but was about giving an opportunity for the viewer to just sit in the psychological life of the character. So it wasn't necessarily telling you something about them, but almost because it wasn't trying to tell you something about them, ideally you would learn something about them. So again, it was like trying to have every scene try to be specific on that emotion that the scene was about and the thing that that person was feeling, so that you could feel those ebbs and flows of hope as you're speaking about. But I feel like weirdly, I even felt it some days when we'd be composing. I remember there was a scene where three boys are getting like frisked by as a police officer looks on, and, on the day we shot it, it was difficult for me to look into the lens. It was difficult for me to compose because the image felt visceral in a way that I kind of think I underestimated. That just seeing in the body of someone else be in this situation was so kind of emotionally like I don't know. It felt weird sitting in my body just looking at the image, which, those were the days that might have been hard or the moments that might have been hard, but those are the things that felt really exciting because it felt, I was like, oh man, I'm feeling an emotion that I haven't really felt before from an image in doing this. And it's specific because the image is in motion. Because if it was a still image, I would have an experience, but it wouldn't be like this. But because it's in motion and because it's someone looking around at the world, there's an intimacy to that something happens. Yeah, I don't really know what it is, but it felt like my stomach got tight.
Mm.
Um, but again, I think that was Ramel and I wouldn't stop until we felt that with almost everything. Like we wouldn't stop until we had feeling from every shot. And that like made it difficult, but like was a thing where it's like, we don't wanna and a band because we're telling a story of real people. Like, Dozier Academy, the school that Nickel Boys is based on, closed in 2011. 2011.
Wow.
And the bodies started being exhumed in 2013. So you're actually talking about a place that isn't from the Jim Crow South. It's a place that existed in the Jim Crow South, but it was open in, I think, 1911 or 1901. So it's a place that was in operation for almost 100 years. And it was a place that closed 10 years ago. There
That's
are people who are living on Earth who are my age or slightly older than me who were at Dozier Academy, period.
mm,
Right.
Like, so there's a way in which when you're making these images, it isn't just a fictional idea. And I think that was something Ramel and I really took seriously. These are real people. This is a story based on real people. These are real people, and in some cases, real people who lost their lives inside of this institution. And like that's kind of also a point of why we never showed violence in the movie,
mm,
because a lot of the archival footage that's in the movie are the real images from the forensic document, the Dozier
Right.
document of the real institution. And to us, it's like, what image can we possibly make that would be more disturbing than just these real images that exist from this institution, these real images that exist of a marble that was exhumed in a corpse? Like, what could we possibly do
mm,
to compete with the profundity of that? So then it became, well, let's not compete. Let's honor that and just recontextualize those images. Let's emotionally imbue those images with the life that is always attached to them. But
Right.
images, sometimes you can get forensic. You can say, oh, that
mhm,
was an atrocity.
mm.
It's an atrocity because, 2.5 million people died. That's a lot of people.
That's a
But
lot.
weirdly, when you say three
Right.
people died, it hits you a different way because you emotionalize that fact, because three people. You can think of seeing three people in front of you. You can't think of thinking of 1.2 million people in front of you. Like, it's the
Mhm.
human brain, it falls apart on that. So I think a lot of this project was about how do we emotionalize these facts and not
Mm.
distort them, but
Right.
merely give the audience the opportunity and the invitation into thinking, oh, right, these are like real people, in a way that it's like, oh, some boys are like stupid, like some boys are assholes. Like that's a real thing, but also no one deserves to get killed over any of those
Yeah,
things. Um,
It's so
so
frightening that
yeah.
current too. I mean, 2013. My God.
that's
Truly.
it's
And I
hard.
think that was a huge like a huge part for Nora Mendes, our production designer's research, where it was like, again, luckily we had so many images of the Dozier School in different stages of
Mm,
time. But so we based a lot of the production design and the building of the spaces on the Dozier document, but also on institutions in operation today, on Rikers, on many different correctional institutions, because again, it's like, and that was a big part of Nickel and the aesthetic. We never wanted to have like, a patina to the image so it felt old or anachronistic, nor I
Mm.
never wanted the production design to feel like period, because there's a way in which, again, Nickel probably looked exactly like this in 2011. Like,
mhm,
institutions like this don't change, they don't overhaul, they don't do renovations.
Right.
So there's a way in which it actually is a very timeless space precisely because of these aspects. And we wanted to really embrace that visually throughout the movie to, like, I'd say very lightly and subtextually gesture towards like these places aren't actually alien. I think that there's a way in which they're scarier because you can imagine a lot of these
mhm.
spaces.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these spaces are still in operation in many
Yeah.
places in the United States and in Canada. Like, many of these reform schools still
Mhm.
are in operation and still happen. So again, it's
Yeah.
about trying to find an emotional tie to facts. We know facts, but let's think about our mother there. Let's think about our
Mhm.
brother there. Let's think about our friend there. That changes how we interpret and understand those facts
The
because it
whole
makes them
family
more human,
dynamic.
ideally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
once you put a face and a name to a fact and a statistic, it becomes a story. It becomes a person, and not
Yeah.
Exactly.
just a detached number, like you said. A million people is really hard to comprehend, but a face and a name becomes
A
real.
family.
Yeah,
Totally.
becomes real. That was a beautiful answer, by the way.
Great
Mhm.
answer.
I'm gonna go to another question here. And yep, I just wanted to mention because the guys, Brandon and Darren, texted me that a ton of people have stuck around. Most people have stuck around for the Q&A. So this is great. Thank you
Oh my God,
guys.
thank you
Oh
guys
yeah.
so
This has
much.
been really fun. And I'm gonna ask the question, but before I ask it, I'm gonna take the opportunity to do a little quick plug. Everyone, just please go follow Lark House. Stay in touch. And the reason I'm gonna do the plug now is because the question is around just resources to dive into of the emotional more of the emotion in developing films than just like the technical aspects. And one of the things that we are working on is to create those types of resources. I think even the conversation that I had with Johnny we did an interview and we chatted. I mean, it was a lot about his story, but a lot about overcoming obstacles and a lot about developing a philosophy for life. And like you said, it's easy to think, okay, lenses, I can go and read AC Magazine, which is incredible, and you can find technical information, but often it's required to develop philosophy and a way of thinking is to dive deeper. And that's a lot of what we are working on. Johnny and I are due for another conversation that we need to film soon. We were going to recently,
Please.
but we couldn't. So we're going to do that soon. But yeah, please stay in touch. We're going to do a lot more. And Jomo, I would love to do more with you. I love the way
Love
that
to.
your brain operates, the way that you think about creating
Right.
images. It's incredible. But so this question is do you have any books that you would recommend to learn more about the emotional side of cinematography and how camera placement, lens choice, movement, etc., brings out an emotional response in the viewer?
Man, this is a great question. This is a great question. You know, First and foremost, I would say, and why I was just so excited to do this conversation is like, I stand on the backs of many people and many people on Johnny's of thoughts of like so many things that conversations Johnny and I have had outside of this space in real life about not just cinematography, but about life, about family, like those things those things are everything to this discussion. And I think that mentors and having mentors over time and experiencing their life and their wisdom throughout life is that's a huge thing for me. And I think probably the fundamental resource I think about when I think about all of these things about the idea of emotional storytelling is like connecting with real people on their journeys. And I would say in terms of books itself, a huge one to me is basically anything Harris Savides ever wrote. I think the book New Cinematographers is a huge one for me of how he talks about his process and his connection to emotionality with that is a huge one. Nestor Almendros's memoirs, Man with a Camera, is a huge one for me. It's also things where it's like things that have nothing to do with cinema, like Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where it's like him trying to almost do a psychoanalytic study of racism and then that falling apart and then it becoming this like weird thing where it's like a mix of poetry, personal experience, Hegelian dialectic theory, and like all of it just feels like it's put in a blender because almost as if he's saying the experience of being a black French man is so complicated that it's impossible to deliver that idea cogently, so it has to just be this cacophony of information. I think is always something I think about in terms of how do we create images of lives that are too complex to ever be held within four walls. That's rhetorical, but like to me is an important question to always ask of the image is we are trying to do an impossible thing. No image could ever tell the full life of someone, and no image should, because that is kind of how images are being used, and that only helps build prejudices that I think we need to break. So it's about how do we imbue an image to invite someone to think more deeply. Like that's how I always think. Like not an image that says what someone should feel, but an image that invites them to question why they feel the way they feel. And is there something deeper operating, or maybe there isn't. But other things for emotional. Yeah, honestly, like I just like to really it's interacting with other art too. It's like music is a huge one. Like, there are albums that like click me into an emotion. So I think that I'm just a an observer and an excited participant in the art that other people make, and just like, again, kind of almost creating a catalog inside myself of like, oh, when I listen to this, how do I feel? And why do
Yes.
I feel like that? Like, what's making me feel like that? Is it how the sound design is on Bjork's Vespertine? Like, why do I feel a certain way when I listen to that? Why do I
Hmm.
feel a certain way when I listen to Black Christ of the Andes? What's happening there? And so I feel like I just try to catalog those things in myself, um, to just think about. Another huge one for me is Kerry James Marshall has an amazing um, essay called Notes to a Young Artist. That is like, I read that genuinely like every few months. Like I feel like that essay is so incredible, and in it Kerry James Marshall is just saying, okay, as artists, like we don't talk through the gods. It isn't as woo woo and spiritual. Like truly it's a thing where it's like every day we just go into the lab, we put two things next to each other, and we write down how do they make us feel when these two things are next to each other. And then you put another thing, and it's just about juxtapositions, putting juxtapositions,
Right.
and then notating what's happening when those two things sit together. It's like Eisenstein talked about this with the theory of the montage, like the Koshlov effect, where it's like picture of man, picture of plate, picture of man, picture of coffin. One is the idea is incepted into you that the man is hungry. Same picture of man next to picture of coffin, the man is mourning a death. It's like it forms a third image. So it's like that is the theory of montage. That is how images sit next to each other. That's how we interpret them. So then, like, just taking note of, okay, when this image sits next to this image, what does it do to me? How does it make me feel? Like that's something that I feel like I do to try to just get better at this. But genuinely, this is something on a bus. Like if I'm sitting around, I just look at something and look at something else, and then like ask myself, like, man, how do those two things together? What do they make me feel? Make me feel something,
Well,
and
that's
just kind of like categorizing that like helps me when I then talk to a director, being like, okay, well, if you want to get this feeling, what happens when we put these two things next to each other? What happens to you when you see that? Okay, what happens when you take these two things next to each other? You add this fourth thing next to that. How does that change the first two things? I don't know. Um, yeah.
you're describing something that's nutritional. All those
Mm,
sorts, all those resources. We cannot be afraid to experience life. We can't be afraid to get hurt. We can't be afraid to take fear into account. All those things, and it's just like some days I will just walk through a museum. It's like eating. It just becomes a part of you, and that's so important. And you just described it so well, is we have to incorporate those things as parts of us. And not always look at them so intellectually, but look at them with the innocence of a child, so that so we absorb them. They become nutrition for our vision and the way we shape things. And we become like a hard drive, that downloads the morning light and downloads the
mm,
passing of somebody through a window. Just
mm.
goes in here. And you may not even know it, but Nickel Boy has expressed all of those things that you've taken in so many different ways. And Rommel as well, to be able to frame a picture is to be able to just, the totality of a moment is expressed every
Mm.
time us as artists do something, and I'm so happy we got to have this conversation.
Me too. I think that yeah, I couldn't imagine saying it better than that. Yeah, that's it. Like life is the work and the work is life. Like
There you go. There you go.
the two are a mirror to one another. It's not to say that everything's labor, it's to say that everything affects the work it does. It's impossible not to. Um
Everything. It is. It's impossible.
Well, this is great. There is a question about the visual manifesto, if that is available or even
disseminated.
allowed to be shared.
Oh, allowed? Absolutely. Man, I would need to look it up. I would need to look it up. I because it's like so technical and kind of like this is the way we need to operate. Like and the I'll say this, the manifesto also would have examples in it where it would be like, remember, and each day we would kind of reread it to each other. It's like, remember that if a glass falls and shatters, in our camera language, traditionally, the shot is an empty ground, a glass comes into frame, a glass shatters. In our camera language, it always has to be we are looking somewhere, a glass shatters, and we turn, and the glass is already shattered. And it's not that we turn slowly and see it, we have to turn immediately because we heard a sound. We're reacting, but we are always late to every action as it happens. And if we see something as it happens, it must always be by mistake. It can never be composed fully. So that was a thing we would kind of always tell ourselves, which again, like Sam Ellison, our operator, is a brilliant, 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 brilliant camera operator. And this also meant that kind of like you're always going to be a quarter late to the 20 years of muscle memory you've developed on camera operating. You know what I mean? And you need to see that as an asset and not as like, oh, I messed up that shot. It's like, no, the point is to kind of always be a little bit behind because that's kind of what human life feels like. You see things that are important usually by accident and you often miss the things as they happen but you catch responses and that's usually what informs how we understand a situation. So yeah, it was more ideas around that in that space. But man, I haven't actually read the manifesto in a second, so I'd have to look it up to see where the hell it is. But yeah, it was kind of like around ideas like that to just orient ourselves every day to kind of the visual language that Ramel was trying to build with this project, so that again we came into every day trying to deprogram um, what we've built muscle memory for many of us for most of our lives, and certainly
Yeah.
most of our lives as it relates to cinema.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Great, great. Well, I am going to start wrapping it up because I could keep going, but I know,
Yeah, we could.
Jomo, you
The
probably have
feeling
a
is
lot.
similar.
You probably have a lot to do. You're impress circle and doing all the things, and Johnny, you as
Oh,
well. Johnny, you're so gracious to hang out. I know you haven't been
yes.
feeling good, so
But
thank you for doing
Raul,
this.
I have to tell you, what you're doing is so valuable. And what you've been doing, interviewing other cinematographers and artists, it's just such a contribution. It's such a valuable thing that you're doing. And it's just like what we're doing today. I mean, it's valuable today, but imagine it years from now. It's so valuable.
Mm,
Thank
Mm,
you so much for this.
mm.
And
thank
Jomo,
you,
I
thank you.
love you. I love you, and I'm
Oh,
so glad we got to do this, brother. It's
I
so
am
good.
so happy, and as I've said, I'm just so happy to be talking to you. You have taught me so much
You have
as
a
a
good time.
cinematographer, as a man. So it really means so much to be talking to you about these
Yeah.
ideas that I know we've been talking about in many different ways for maybe a decade. Genuinely, like almost 10 years, we've been having all of these conversations, and I
Yeah,
feel
we
like
have.
in a lot of ways, this
Mm.
movie feels like looking at your photography, being in your studio, thinking about these images, thinking about that period and some of your own images were definitely big references for me on this movie. So it feels really wonderful because this feels like a long conversation we've been
Mm.
having.
It does. It feels
Well,
like continuation.
Yeah.
and we definitely have to do it again. Thank you, Johnny. I appreciate
Thank you,
your comment
Raul.
there. We have been
Mm.
talking about the first time I met Johnny, and we recorded a conversation at the ASC. I told myself, I thought, okay, this man is number one, very special,
Oh God, you're
and
making me
I
blush.
want to, I want to make it a priority for us to share his wisdom and his message and everything that he has meant to a lot of people as a mentor. So, Johnny, I think we're due for another conversation. There's a lot also to explore. There were a couple questions about leadership and just other, again, topics that aren't just the technical things. So, we are sharing in the chat Instagram. We're going to be posting this whole recording on YouTube. And there's also an interest form that we put together. I don't know if it's. I just saw that you can't really copy it, but we'll share it on Instagram. But basically, we want to hear as we're developing different resources. Right now, we're working on a workshop just on lenses, how to objectively evaluate lenses and look at them.
Oh, that's great.
We're developing other things again around leadership or develop a philosophy around images. We're talking potentially crossing fingers to get Greggy Fraser on a kind of masterclass about shooting on a volume. So
Mm,
there's a lot of things that we have in the works. So please stay tuned. Fill out that interest form because that also helps us know what kind of resources are valuable to you. And then, yeah, let's do this again. Thank you guys. You guys have been incredible. Again, I could keep this going for a while, but I know everyone's got things to do. So thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Jomo.
Thank you
And
so much,
Thank you
Jomo.
so
Talk to
much.
you soon.
let's
All
let's
right.
chat
Talk to
real
you
I'll
soon.
soon.
Thank you guys so much.
All right. Bye bye.